Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always. What are we tackling today?
Well, this time it's something called regression discontinuity design.
Ah, RDD, the classic.
It does sound a bit intimidating, I'll admit.
Don't worry, the concept itself is surprisingly simple.
Okay, well, the listener sent over some material about it.
Perfect. That'll give us something concrete to work with.
It focuses on whether going to a flagship university really impacts earnings later in life. Does that prestigious diploma actually open doors?
Right. Does it actually cause a difference, or is it more about the type of student who gets into those schools in the first place?
Exactly. So RDD is supposed to help us figure that out, even though we can't, run a perfect experiment where we randomly send some kids to flagship schools and others to, well, not.
Exactly. It's all about finding those natural experiments that exist out in the world. And that's where the power of RDD comes in.
So I've heard it described as the next best thing to a randomized controlled trial, which I know those are like the gold standard in research.
Absolutely. RDD is definitely up there for sure. A close second. It takes advantage of situations where things are almost randomly decided.
Okay, so let's talk about those situations. The listener specifically mentioned a researcher named Mark Hoekstra.
Well, Hoekstra did some really interesting work on this. He focused on the University of Florida, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so he used RDD to see how students who just barely made the cut for admission to the University of Florida compared to the students who just missed it.
Exactly. It's like finding those close calls, those tiny differences that tip the scales one way or the other.
I'm hooked on those close calls. Tell me more about how these flagship universities actually make those decisions. Is it all about grades?
Well, it's usually a mix of things, but Hoekstra really honed in on GPA and SAT scores.
Mm-hmm.
They had a point system where a specific SAT score was needed for each GPA level. So let's say a 3.0 GPA. A student might need 1,000 warts on it to even be considered. But if your GPA was a little lower, say 2.9, you might need an 1,100, kind of like a sliding scale.
Oh, so like if a student with that 2.9 GPA got an 1150, they would have like 50 points. But a student with a 3.0 and the same 1150 would have 150 points. It seems kind of unfair.
It's not really about being fair or unfair. It's just one part of the admissions process.
Mm.
They also consider things like extracurriculars, essays, all that stuff. But this point system based on GPA and SAT is what Shakespeare focused on because it creates that cutoff. It's like a clear dividing line.
Okay, I see. So only students who had positive points ended up being admitted. And this is where those close calls come in, right?
You got it.
It-
We're looking at students who are either just above or just below that 0-point cutoff.
Because those students are probably pretty similar, right, in terms of like their potential or preparation.
Yeah.
But one group gets that flagship university experience and the other doesn't.
That's the idea. It's almost like they were randomly assigned to different groups,
Mm.
which, as we were saying, is kind of the whole point of a randomized controlled trial, right?
It's like we're peeking into an alternate reality where some things are just slightly different.
Exactly. Now, I did notice that the listener also mentioned something about sharp and fuzzy RDD.
Oh, yeah, I saw that too. What's the difference? I didn't quite get that.
Well, think of sharp RDD like a light switch.
That-
It's either on or off, like a clear yes or no. A great example is those government stimulus checks. If your income was below a certain threshold, bam, you automatically got a check. No wiggle room.
Okay, so the stimulus checks are a perfect example of a sharp RDD situation. But with flagship universities, it's more complicated.
Right, that's where fuzzy RDD comes in. The cutoff matters a lot, but it's not the only thing. Even if you're above that score, your essay could be terrible, or you didn't do any extracurriculars, so you still might not get in.
Ah, so it's like even if you score above the SAT cutoff, it doesn't guarantee enrollment. Kind of like how a high GPA doesn't guarantee you'll get into Harvard.
Exactly. There are always those other factors. That's the fuzziness. But even with the fuzziness, RDD can still give us some clues.
By focusing on those students near the cutoff.
Precisely.
Okay, so even with this close call setup, I imagine there are some rules to make sure the RDD magic actually works. You can't just compare apples and oranges.
Yeah, you're catching on. Absolutely. There are two really important assumptions we need to feel good about. So the first assumption is all about similarity.
Okay, similarity. Like, what do we need to be similar?
Well, we want those students right around the cutoff, those who barely made it versus those who just missed it.
Right, those close calls.
Exactly. Those students, we want them to be pretty much alike.
Okay.
Not just in the things we can easily measure, like, obviously, their GPA and test scores.
Right.
But also, and this is important, in things we can't directly observe.
Like what?
like their motivation, their work ethic, maybe family support, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense.
Because if there are underlying differences between those two groups of students, the ones just above and just below that cutoff,
Uh-huh.
it really muddles the results.
We can't be sure it's the flagship university experience itself that's making the difference.
Right.
Gotcha. So what's the second assumption?
So the second big one is that people can't manipulate the system.
Manipulate, like cheat.
Kind of. Well, not cheap, but, intentionally trying to end up on a specific side of the cutoff.
Okay, so like if students knew the exact score they needed to get into that flagship university, they might just keep retaking the SAT over and over again.
You got it. That's a perfect example. They'd keep trying until they hit that magic number.
Huh.
Or imagine if you knew the exact marathon finish time you needed to win a big prize.
Oh, I see what you mean. You'd push yourself a little harder to cross that line at the right time.
Right. That kind of manipulation would mess everything up. It wouldn't be a real close call anymore.
Luckily, with Hoekstra's study, students wouldn't have known those exact cutoffs in advance.
Right. And it's not like those stimulus checks we were talking about where you could, try to change your income to qualify.
Okay, so the two assumptions are similarity near the cutoff and no manipulation.
Got it. So we've got the setup, we've got the assumptions, but how do researchers actually see the RDD magic happening? Do they have like the RDD microscope or
Well,
something?
not a microscope, but they can visualize the data in a way that really highlights the effect.
Okay, how?
Imagine a graph, okay? On one axis, we have the running variable. So in this case, that's the SAT score.
Got it.
And on the other axis, we have the outcome we're interested in. Like, maybe it's earnings later in life.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And we plot all the data points, and then we look for what happens right at that cutoff point.
The 0 points for university admission.
Exactly. So if there's like a sudden jump or maybe a drop right at that spot,
Uh-huh.
that discontinuity is the evidence we're looking for. That's the sign that the treatment, in this case, going to the flagship university, actually had an impact. So it's like a treasure map. And that cutoff point is where X marks the spot.
Okay. So what did Hoekstra find? Did going to a flagship university actually boost earnings?
Well, he found some really interesting stuff. First, he found a significant jump in enrollment right above the cutoff.
Meaning more students went to the flagship university if they scored just above that line. Makes sense.
Yep. And it was a big jump, almost 40% higher.
Whoa, 40%. That's huge.
It is. It really shows you how important that cutoff point was. But, the real question is, did it actually lead to higher earnings later on?
Yeah. Did those extra students who got in because of the cutoff, did they end up making more money?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. So Hoekstra estimated that being admitted to the flagship university boosted earnings by about 13%.
To 13%. Okay.
But for those who actually enrolled, the boost was even higher, around 22%.
Wait, hold on. Why is there a difference between being admitted and actually enrolling?
That's a great question. Like maybe the students who chose not to enroll, even though they got in, maybe they were already on a different path, like they had other amazing opportunities or something.
It's possible. Unfortunately, Hoekstra's data doesn't give us a clear answer on that.
Oh.
It's one of those things that pops up in research, more questions. But that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, I guess so. So even with this fancy tool like RDD, we still end up with some unanswered questions.
Absolutely. Research is all about opening up those new avenues for exploration, peeling back the layers of the onion and seeing what's underneath.
So true. Well, before we go down too many rabbit holes, let's bring it back to the big picture.
Sounds good.
For our listener, what's the main takeaway here?
I think the main takeaway is that RDD is a really powerful tool. It can help us figure out cause and effect in all sorts of situations. But, and this is a big but,
Okay, what's the but?
it's not a magic bullet. It's about finding the right situations where it applies.
Like those close calls.
Exactly. Situations with those clear cutoff points. And of course, we have to be confident in those two assumptions we talked about.
Similarity and no manipulation.
Right. It's kind of like imagine a detective's toolkit. RDD is a specialized tool. Really effective when used correctly, but not for every case.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm starting to see how it all fits together, but now I'm wondering, how could our listener apply this close calls thinking in their own life or maybe at work, outside of the world of flagship universities and earnings?
Interesting question. Well, I'd say think about those situations where maybe some arbitrary cutoff or a threshold influenced a decision, like maybe there was a promotion that you just missed out on, or maybe you were assigned to a particular project by a very small margin.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Could this RDD way of thinking help you understand how those close calls might have affected things?
Wow, that's making me think differently about some past experiences. Suddenly seeing those moments in a new light. Like, what if things had gone the other way?
Exactly. It's about recognizing those forks in the road, those moments where things could have gone either way, and then really thinking about the what ifs.
It's making me wonder, could you even use RDD to look at something like promotions within a company?
Ooh, interesting.
Like, let's say a company promotes everyone who scores above a certain level on their performance review. Could you use that cutoff to see if getting the promotion actually leads to, I don't know, higher productivity? Or were those high performers already on that track anyway?
Absolutely. That's a great example of how you can apply these RDD principles in a totally different setting. Of course, you still need to think carefully about those key assumptions we talked about. Are the employees right near that performance cutoff really comparable? Could someone have, fudged their numbers a bit to make sure they got over the line? But if everything checks out, RDD could be a really useful way to get some answers.
So it's not just for fancy research studies. It's really about identifying the right situation, that close call scenario, and then being super careful about how you set things up.
Exactly. And don't forget, even Hoekstra's study with the flagship university, it left us with some really interesting unanswered questions, like what makes some students choose to enroll after they get that acceptance letter, while others decide to go a different route? And what about those students who just barely got in? Why do some of them thrive while others maybe don't?
Good point. So even with a powerful tool like RDD, there's always more to investigate. It's like each new discovery just opens up a whole new set of questions, a whole new layer to explore.
You said it. That's what keeps research going.
Well, I think we've done a pretty deep dive into regression discontinuity design, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. It's a fascinating topic.
And hopefully our listener now has a new way to think about cause and effect, whether they're reading research papers or just, making decisions in their own lives.
It really makes you think.
Yeah. Like, did that one decision really make a difference?
Or would things have turned out basically the same anyway?
Right. It kind of makes your head spin a little.
It does.
Mm.
It really highlights just how powerful RDD can be.
Yeah.
Like a new way to think about why things happen the way they do.
And it can challenge those assumptions, the ones we have about why things turn out a certain way.
Absolutely.
Oh,
And who knows, maybe this will even inspire some new research questions for our listener.
well, that's a great thought. I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into regression discontinuity design.
It's been fun.
It has. A big thank you to you for walking us through all of this.
Happy to do it.
And to you, our listener, thanks for joining us on this journey.
Hope you enjoyed it.
We hope you learned some new things about the power of RDD.
And how it can help us make sense of the world.
And maybe even see those hidden connections that are all around us. So until next time, keep exploring.